Hi there, my name's David and I am going to take you through today the process involved in doing an extract beer brew. The reason I'm doing this video is that I'm finding that the extract brew is a really nice halfway house between doing kits and doing what I guess will be a much more involved process in doing all grain brewing. I must confess that I'm quite experienced with doing kits. I've done about 20 or 30 kits over the last sort of 5 to 10 years and I've just started to get into extract brewing. I have no experience at all in all grain brewing, so this video is probably not designed for experts, as I suspect you'll see, but it's more designed for people who have a bit of experience with kits but are now looking maybe to branch out a little bit. One of the things I found with kits is they're absolutely fantastic, and I've found myself doing quite a lot of pimping of these kits in terms of adding different sugars, dry hopping, adding different yeasts, and that's been really enjoyable. But I've been really surprised by extract brewing with its relative simplicity, but also the benefit of being able to make a much wider variety of beers. My experience with extract has been largely to do with making German Weissbier, which is what I really enjoy, partly because I use bottles and it means that the sediment in the bottom can be added to the beer when you pour it, rather than worrying about trying to get it in there or not getting it in there to contaminate the brew. So it's all good. And what I'm going to show you is a Belgian Witbier, which I've not made before, but I've got all of the ingredients for. It's not too different to Weissbier, and I'm going to take you through the whole process. Okay, so I hope that you enjoy this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by talking about equipment, and then talking about ingredients, and then after that I'll take you through the whole process. Cheers. So I'm going to take you through some of the basic equipment that you're going to need for this Belgian Witbier extract brew. And the first thing to mention is that I'm drawing on a couple of books here that I found particularly helpful, both in terms of kits and also the extract brewing that I'm doing, which will be very familiar to those of you who are getting into homebrew and know a bit about it. One of the books I've got is Greg Hughes's Homebrew Beer, which takes you through step by step all of the processes involved in extract brewing, which is absolutely fantastic. I've not been paid to endorse this book, by the way. And the other book that I rely on quite a bit as well is James Morton's Brew. I absolutely think that this is one of the best brewing books that you can get. James Morton, if you remember, was somebody on the Bake Off. He's actually a medic by trade and works in my part of the world in central Scotland. And it's a wonderful book. It doesn't actually take you through, it doesn't really talk about extract brews, but it's got so much in the way of sensible, common sense advice for sanitizing, getting you into really good habits, but also then giving you lots of hints and tips and ideas. And it really is such a comprehensive guide and a very sort of chatty guide as well. So those two books have really been my mainstay, and it's a recipe from Greg Hughes' books that I'm going to be using today, and it's the German, as I say, it's the Belgian Witbier or Witbier, and I'll put a little sort of show of the recipe up on the screen here as I show you the equipment. Cheers. Okay, so I'm going to take you through just some of the basic equipment that you need. Now, to bear in mind, what I'm going to show you today is a half batch brew, a half batch extract brew, and therefore the equipment is with that in mind. I find half batches a really useful thing to do because I can put my pot on an ordinary stove, such as the one I've got here in the kitchen, without any sort of major hassles. So it's going to be a half batch brew, so that's around about 10 to 12 litres or so. So first thing to show you that I use is some sanitisation. Of course, that's probably one of the most important things that you want to get right. And the two things that I use the VWP sanitizer, which is a really good bit of kit, pretty vicious stuff. Remember to wear gloves, but that will sanitize all of your equipment extremely well, extremely thoroughly. Starsan. And Starsan is a very, very helpful cleaner, in that when you dilute it into a little bottle like this, what you can then do is just simply spray your equipment to give it an extra clean without then worrying about having to rinse out, unlike with this stuff which needs to be rinsed out. So this is a really useful thing, just a very small solution of Starsan, although it's expensive, is really helpful because you can then ensure that you're keeping things that you're using, such as thermometers or hydrometers or whatever else, clean by just giving them a quick squirt of this, that you then don't have to worry about running under the tap. So that's the sanitization done. This thing here is my main pot that I put all of my ingredients into. And this is just a very simple 12-litre steel pot. You could probably get it from any sort of hardware store, to be honest with you. I got it from an online brewing company. And you can see that it has no fancy attachments, it's got no hop filter, and therefore it's relatively cheap, which is the great thing. So that's my main pot. And then for those of you who've done kits, you'll understand that there are a few very basic sort of things that you need, not least a paddle for your stirring, or a ladle for your stirring, thermometer. I tend to use a manual one, partly because my electronic one got water in it and went kerplunk, and it's highly accurate, although you have to be careful because it's glass, obviously. The other thing, obviously, a hydrometer, which you'll be familiar with from any work that you've done with your kits as well. Beyond that, plastic bucket, fairly straightforward. And this is for a half batch as well. Another nice thing about the half batches that I should say is that they can easily fit in and take up smaller space when you're fermenting, obviously. Last thing is a bit of an indulgence, and it's not something that you need to have. You'll be familiar that when we get to the stage of putting things on the stove and boiling wort and creating it that way, whether it's through extract or all grain, there comes a point where we have to cool the wort very rapidly for various reasons, and you can do that particularly with a half batch with a sink full of ice or whatever else. You don't need to use this thing, but this is a homemade wort chiller, which is surprisingly easy to make if you've got a 10-meter coil of copper, which you can get from any B&Q outlet, and wrap around a 5-litre paint pot. So it's a remarkably simple thing, and I find that this put into a tiny little pot like the 12-litre thing cools the wort so quickly, so rapidly, that it's a highly effective thing. So I wouldn't be without this now, and rather pleased with it I am. So that's about us. There's probably a few things that I've forgotten. There's bits and bobs, of course, that you need in terms of your lid for your fermenter and your little bubbler and things like that, but there's loads of places online that will show you any additional ingredients. But these are virtually all of the equipment I think that I need, and all of the things that you'll need if you're doing an extract brew. So I'm going to talk you through now a little bit about the ingredients for the Belgian Witbier. And again, I'm using Greg Hughes's excellent book to give us a recipe for the Witbier. The beauty of Greg Hughes's book is that he provides lots of recipes for all grain, but many of them have a malt extract version for you to use, and this is what I'm looking at. So I can see that the ingredients that I need includes dried wheat malt extract, which is this stuff here. So you'll often find this, that you can get spray malt, but make sure if you're doing this recipe that this is wheat malt that you're getting, because this is basically a wheat beer that we're making. So it's wheat malt as opposed to just standard spray malt. And I've got around somewhere between about 1.5 kilograms and 2 kilos for this half half batch. And it reminds me to state that probably one of the downsides of making extract brews is the cost. This is one of the big sort of detrimental factors about making this. There are few detrimental factors about making extract brews, but the issue of cost is really a big one. It's probably the most expensive type of beer that you can make, including kits, simply because the malt extract is so expensive. So that's the one downside, if I'm being honest. So back to ingredients. We've got enough spray malt. This recipe also requires sat hops as well, which you've got there, which is grand. And then what we also need is some protofloc, which, if you're not familiar with that, is just a thinning agent, and you can get that from any brew store online or wherever else. Don't seem to have it at the moment, which is just sort of like Irish moss, and you just add a little half teaspoon of that, which we'll show you during the process. This time around, I have got some Mangrove Jack's M21 Belgian wheat yeast. Now, very often what I've been doing with the Bavarian Weissbier that I have made previously, I've got a Smack Pack liquid yeast, which is extremely good. So this is kind of the first time I've been trying a dried yeast, and I know that there's a lot of snobbery around what types of yeast you should be using, but I'm going to go with this, and I'm sure it'll be absolutely fine. Last things for this particular recipe is I've got bitter orange peel as well, and coriander seeds as well. All right, so this is I think the sort of equivalent, you can tell from the recipe, is a wee bit like Blue Moon, if you're familiar with that from the supermarkets. Dreadful name, by the way, but really nice beer with that sort of orangey taste to it. Not to everybody's taste, but I really quite like it, and I'm expecting or guessing that this brew will come out a little bit like that, perhaps. Okay, so these are all the ingredients that you need. An expensive type of brew, unfortunately, particularly for a half batch, but let's see how we get on with the process. So just before we begin, this particular recipe recommends that we use about 1.35 kilograms of dried wheat malt extract, which I've shown you. The instructions in the Greg Hughes book also recommend that you start off by boiling around about 10 litres of water, and then just a kilogram, I think it is, of spray malt, and then simply add the balance, the rest of the spray malt and water at the towards the end of the brew. So I'll take you through that, but that's a really nice, easy way to get going. So as you've just seen, we've added 10 litres of water as per Greg Hughes' instructions, and that's actually warm water from a combi boiler, which James Morton tells us is an okay thing to do as long as our water is not contaminated. And I've also sanitised the tap and let it run for 2-3 minutes as well. So there's 10 litres on the boil now, and I'm going to wait until it boils, and then I'm going to add my 1 kilogram of wheat malt, and also the recipe instructs me to add the Sats hops, the 16 grams of hops from the outset. And it's at that point I'll start the timer. The total length of this boil will be 1 hour and 10 minutes. Okay, see you in a while. So we're just about approaching boiling point, so I'm going to go ahead now and put in my 1 kilogram of wheat malt. This can be a bit of a messy process because the steam coming from the pot can often sort of make the spray malt a little bit sticky, so I'll rinse it out if that happens, and put the rest of it in, so it's not a problem. So here we go. So I've managed to successfully add my 1 kilogram of wheat malt and my 16 grams of Sats hops, and I've just transferred the pot over to a lower heat. At this point, the obvious thing to state is that you need to be really careful that your pot doesn't boil over. Very close to doing that there, and once it's boiling and once it's bubbling away, you can use a smaller hob if you have such a thing, but be extremely careful that you are watching all the time for the potential for the pot to boil over. So we're about 15 minutes into the boil now, everything's going really nicely. You can just see hopefully that there's a sort of a rolling boil to the pot here, so it's not going completely mad, but it's also, you know, it's obviously working it round, so it's just keeping up that temperature. So it's just about adjusting your gas to the point where it's just producing that, what we call a rolling boil. So we'll come back in a little while and see how we're doing. And the crucial time here is at 55 minutes, when we're going to be adding some of the ingredients such as the protoflop, coriander and bitter orange, and then just after that, probably at about an hour, we'll be putting in the balance of the spray malt, which I'm just going to go and measure out now. So as we're waiting for the boil to proceed, as it is, we're into about 20-25 minutes now. I just thought I'd clarify something with this recipe. The protoflop, which is the fining agent, which is this sort of stuff here, looks a bit like pepper. If I can get the lid off without it going everywhere. That goes in 15 minutes prior to the end of the boil, so that's at 55 minutes. And then the bitter orange peel, which is this stuff here, and the coriander, they go in at an hour, so that's 10 minutes before the end of the boil. So just to be clear then, that the protoflop goes in at 15 minutes before the end of the boil, which is at 55 minutes, and then the orange peel and the coriander goes in at 10 minutes prior to the end, so that's at an hour according to my timer. And it's at that point, 10 minutes before the end of the boil, that I'll add the balance, the 350 grams balance of the spray malt, along with the orange peel and the coriander. I hope that makes sense. I don't know whether you can see this, but I've just had a wee test of my cooler, and as you can see, it seems to be working very well with the water just coming out there. There's a bit of a Heath Robinson situation I have, which is that I'm feeding the line from the outside tap in, and what happens, for those of you who are not familiar with this, is that the water goes into the cooler and goes down to the bottom and then loops back up, hopefully taking the heat of the wort with it, and then feeding out here. And it's remarkable when I've done this before, just how hot the water is that comes out, which gives you an idea of the efficiency of this cooler and how quickly it extracts heat from the wort. Very hot water comes out. You actually have to be very careful. A little bit of time to go. Okay, so we're nearly at the 55-minute mark into the boil, and as per the instructions in the recipe, I'm going to add half a teaspoon rather than a whole teaspoon, because it's a half batch of protoflop. This is the fining agent. In it goes. And in 5 minutes time I'll come back and we'll add the additional ingredients that we've talked about before for a final 10 minutes. Well, we've finally reached that time where we are 10 minutes off the end of the boil, so I'm going to, without further ado, add the bitter orange and the coriander. 12.5 grams, 12.5 grams. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to briefly turn the flame off and add the balance of the spray malt now as well. Looking good. You could see there that some of the spray malt stuck to the container, but it was easily just scraped off and put back in. I'm smelling that bitter orange and it's fantastic. So you saw there that I just put the flame out to prevent any boil over, but back on for the final 10 minutes of the boil. It's getting exciting now. Okay, so it's time. In a few moments I'm going to switch the flame off, turn the flame off, and that will be the end of our boil. And then you'll be able to see how the cooler works. Here we go. Flame out. So you can see that I've gently put the cooler in now, lock, stock and barrel, and I'm going to keep on checking the temperature now, hopefully as the temperature starts to reduce, but not before sanitizing again the thermometer. I can already feel the heat of the water in the sink there. So let's have a look. So we can expect the temperature to still be quite high, obviously. It's around about 80 degrees even now after flame out, with the temperature dropping all the time, so I'll come back to it in a wee second. It's at this point that I might need to increase the speed of the water running through the system, the cooler, just to make sure that that heat is carried away a little bit faster. Checking the temperature again. Remarkably, the temperature is now down between 55 and 60 degrees. That's literally within the space of about a minute. And it really is falling all of the time, and this is exactly what you want at this stage, bearing in mind that now is the time that the risk for contamination increases, and we want this temperature down as quickly as we possibly can, so that we can get fermentation going, and hopefully things will go smoothly. So we've reached 30 degrees very quickly, time for removal. It's unwieldy but highly effective. So it's time now to transfer the completed wort into the fermenter, and what you'll notice here is that I have placed a sanitised and sterilised hop strainer over the fermenting bin. So let's see how we get on. You'll notice that I tried to do that at quite a high height. At this point it's really important to get as much oxygen into the wort as possible to allow the yeast to do its job. Probably committing heinous crimes as we speak. Leave a comment. I'm estimating that to be around about the correct original gravity of around 145, and that's made it up to about 10 litres or so. So I'm going to check the temperature again, and then I'm going to pitch my yeast, and that will be us. So I had a bit of a hassle in that my thermometer has decided it will break at the last minute. So I'm not entirely sure what the temperature is likely to be, but because I've got a setup in the cabin that has got temperature regulation, which I'm going to show you in a little while, I'm hoping that it's okay. Now this is the yeast that I'm about to pitch, and I'm only going to pitch about half of it because it's only a half batch. And that's us. Right, so this is the cabin, and we have something that will be very familiar to most of you, which is a fermentation chamber, which is just an old fridge, and I'm lucky enough to have an Inkbird temperature regulator, which has a plug going into the fridge and also a plug going into a 1 foot tube heater, which I'll just show you in a moment. Temperature set is at 24 degrees, quite a high fermentation temperature, but that's what the temperature is suggested according to the recipe in the Greg Hughes book. So I'm reasonably hopeful that that will do the job. So the temperature is building up now with the tube heater inside the chamber. So I'll just show you inside the fridge. Hopefully you can see that reasonably well. There is our wort. And the hope is that our little mishap with the temperature at pitching has not disturbed things too badly. My only other thought as well is that we didn't really spend an awful lot of time aerating, so that might be something that I have to do, although we did aerate a little bit when we transferred the wort into the fermentation bucket. You can see here as I do a close-up that we're about 10 litres there, which is what we're hoping for, with the OG being reasonably close to what was expected. So the tube heater's there. I'm going to shut things now just to bring that temperature back up or back down, depending on whether or not I put too much heat in. And that's the end of the process. So we'll return in a few days' time to see how things are going with the fermentation, which will hopefully start to take place over the next 24 hours or so. Well, it's now Wednesday. The brewing took place on Saturday, so we've had a few days of the ferment being in the fermentation chamber, which is what you saw last. And I've just come out on the Wednesday evening to take a gravity reading. You might remember that the original gravity before we pitched the yeast was around 1.045 or 1045, or however you want to describe it. And the very good news tonight, and I'm just going to turn this so that you see it. I'm not really sure whether you're going to be able to see it or not, but we'll give it a punt. So the good news is that fermentation has been working tremendously well. Good old yeast. And the gravity now is probably, I'm estimating, around about 112, 114. Which is, given that the recipe had suggested that the final gravity should be around about 1015, we're pretty much bang on. So I'm absolutely delighted, and you can almost see there as well the lovely colour of the Witbier as well. So I'm pretty happy about that. I'm going to take a note of that reading, and I'm going to do it again in a couple of days' time. And if the reading is still the same, I'll proceed to bottling, which is what I hope to do. So we're now at Friday, around about 6 days after the brew, and I'm very briefly just going to take you through the final stages of bottling. As you saw in the little window there, I have been sanitizing some of the bottles using this trusty spray with the star san, as per usual. And I've also been sterilising a secondary bucket with a bottler, which I'm going to transfer the brew that you see here into to make bottling a little bit easier. Now, I'm presuming that most of you will know the bottling procedure, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time, but what I am going to do is I'm just going to take you through a little bit in terms of the sugar that I'll be adding before I bottle. And this will be a racking procedure, so I won't be adding sugar to each bottle, which I know is a popular and perfectly good thing to do. I find that transferring to a secondary bucket just makes sure that I can have the exact amount of sugar that I'm looking for. And I think that's quite important for this Belgian wheat beer, simply because it's a highly carbonated beer, and I want to make sure that I get the correct amount of sugar in for secondary fermentation that I can. So I'm just going to lift the camera now and show you a little bit about all the different bits that we'll be doing, and then we'll get straight to bottling. So there's our trusty brew, and as you saw with the other little window there, we have now reached a final gravity of around about 10-12, and I think I erroneously suggested in the previous video that we should be about 1.015, but in fact, looking at Greg Hughes' book, we should be at around about 1.011, and we're pretty much bang on that now. Probably wisely, what I should be doing is leaving this for another couple of days, but because of the nature of wheat beer, ferments quite quickly and goes off quite quickly. I'm going to be bottling today and taking the chance and hopefully not having any exploding bottles, which I've not done in the past, so hopefully it'll be fine. It's also because it's a Friday. My wife works on a Friday. I don't work on a Friday. I'm lucky not to, which means that I can make as much mess as I possibly can and or need to, and tidy up after that. So there's the brew, and that's going to get transferred in a wee minute to the secondary bucket, which I'll show you. So I'm just panning round. I have measured out around about 110 grams of ordinary granulated sugar. And that's just slightly shy of the amount per litre recommended by Greg Hughes, so I'm hoping that will be sufficient. I think he recommends around about 11.5 grams of sugar per litre for carbonation, so having made a previous German wheat beer with that amount, it's actually bang on, so it should be really good. And in a minute I'm going to make a boiling water solution to put the sugar in, probably only around about 100 or 150 millilitres of boiling water, into which I put my sugar, and then that'll go into the secondary bucket and be just gently stirred with the transferred fermented beer. So you can see that I am sterilising using our trusty VWP cleaner, some of the bits and bobs needed for the secondary bucket, and I'll take you through the transferring of that into the secondary bucket. There's a reasonable tradition to try and siphon the brew into the secondary bucket. I've stopped siphoning simply because of the difficulty of getting the siphoned brew going because of excess carbonation. So I take the risk now of actually transferring the brew, just pouring it and trying to make sure that I'm not adding a huge amount of oxygen, obviously, to the final brew to make it go stale. I've done that a couple of times now, and although it's a bit harum-scarum, it seems to do the job. So here we go. So I've just added the priming sugar, as described earlier. I'm just giving the beer a final tiny little stir. Try not to introduce anything in the way of oxygen, but also evenly distributing the sugar through the beer. Notice that I'm calling it beer now and not wort, because technically that's what it is. Fermentation has taken place. So now I'm just going to simply transfer into bottles. And you can see here that I've got a bottler, which is a really nice little contraption. I'm just moving the camera so that you can see it properly. In fact, I think I'll just move the camera to a lower level so that you can see. And I have my first bottle here, and as you saw earlier, I had sanitized it, so I'm just going to shake the rest of that sanitizer out. Remember, you don't have to rinse out. The beauty of Star San is you don't have to rinse, and away we go. Of course, it would always help if you turn the tap on as well. That's a beneficial thing to do. And the beauty of a bottler means that the beer goes straight to the bottom rather than flowing in from the top, where again the risk of adding oxygen to your brew is higher. And there's something quite therapeutic about using a bottler as well. You have to take your time with it. And there you are, when the beer just gets to the top, Just shaking it off. And then simply using bottle tops in the usual manner. So we're in the utility room for the last video, just to let you know where the completed beer has gone. So I'm quite lucky to have that little area up there that keeps things nicely warm, probably between about sort of 18 and 22 degrees at any one time. And that's where the beer will remain conditioning for the next couple of weeks. So I promise to come back in a couple of weeks' time just to let you know how things have gone, and to pour the beer and give you a sense of whether things have been successful or not. So really appreciate you going on this little trip with me. Hope it's been of some help. That's the end of this particular video, and let me know if that's been helpful to you, or whether there are any glaring omissions that you would put in a video of your own. Cheers!